Hello, everyone. I'm Zach Singer. I'm the research archaeologist with the Maryland Historical Trust, and today I'm going to be presenting on the archaeological resources in the Jug Bay complex. And this research has been facilitated by a collaboration with many institutions and organizations, including the Lost Towns Project, Anne Arundel County's Cultural Resources Division, the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, the Jug Bay Wetland Sanctuary, and Washington College. So before we get into the archaeology, I want to put Jug Bay on the map. So if we look at the map on the right, Jug Bay is located at the position of the purple star. So Jug Bay is along the Patuxent River, kind of at the midpoint of the Patuxent River, where the western branch flows into the Patuxent. Looking at the aerial on the left, you can see Jug Bay as the kind of kidney-shaped thing in the center. Jug Bay itself is a tidal freshwater wetlands that's along the Patuxent River. One of the reasons that Jug Bay is such a great place to do archaeological research is that it's surrounded by both state and county parkland, and that those parks have preserved the archaeological resources and saved them from other development. So Jug Bay is great for having archaeological resources that are still intact and preserved. A lot of archaeological research has been conducted around Jug Bay. So some of the important sites that people might have heard about include Pig Point, Mount Calvert, Billingsley, River Farm, and the Door site. So those are all around the Jug Bay area. So building on this great research that's been conducted at Jug Bay, the Lost Towns Project applied for and was awarded a fiscal year 2019 non-capital grant to continue studying and documenting the Jug Bay cultural complex. And what Lost Towns proposed to do was to conduct a walkover survey to document cultural resources that are threatened by climate change, by erosion along the banks of the Patuxent River and its tributaries, and also by potential park developments, as well as anthropogenic erosion of hiking trails. And so while in the past, individual sites had been studied, like the Pig Point site or Mount Calvert and Billingsley and River Farm, those sites had been studied in detail. What the Lost Towns Project proposed to do was to take a more comprehensive view of Jug Bay as a whole. So look at the cultural complex. So take a step away from site-specific research and instead look at all of the archaeological resources around Jug Bay. So you can see some of the erosional areas at Jug Bay that were investigated. On the left is a portion of a trail at the Pine Barrens, which you can see is pretty bare, which would expose archaeological resources. In the center is a bluff face along the Patuxent River, which is pretty dramatically eroding, as well as other erosional gullies along trails. And so the erosion that's present around Jug Bay is exposing archaeological resources. And so what the Lost Towns Project and partners did was to examine these erosional areas to see if archaeological resources were being impacted. The main method for the original walkover survey is just how it sounds, walking. And so the Lost Towns Project and its partners followed trails, including kind of open trails in meadow, as well as trails across streams through the forest, and trails that were kind of muddy and churned up through horseback riding. And so the whole time, as you can see in all these photos, the walkover survey entails people walking with their head down, right? So looking for archaeological resources that are exposed along these erosional areas of the trails. In addition to walking the trails, researchers looked at the erosion along the banks of the Patuxent and its tributaries. And so on the right, you can see Steph in a bright neon vest walking along the edge of walking along an erosional edge of the Patuxent River and looking for artifacts. And then you can see me on the left, kind of on a more steeper slope examining the erosion for signs of archaeological resources. Other areas that were investigated through the walkover survey, kind of the classic example of plowed field. So walking between the rows of plantings to look for archaeological resources, as well as erosional areas associated with camping or picnic activities. So you can see around these picnic tables, there's exposed soil that was investigated for archaeological resources. And then another great spot to look for archaeology is around tree roots, because the roots as they grow, push up soil and potentially expose cultural resources. In addition to the walkover survey, the partners with the Lost Towns Project also conducted a kayak survey. So looking for cultural resources via kayak along the Patuxent River and its tributaries. And this was really cool because likely the early native peoples as well as colonial people who settled along Jug Bay would have used the Patuxent River as their primary mode of transport. So getting to follow along and see the landscape from the water is really important and interesting to think about where people might have docked their kayaks to then get out and create campsites, or how they got around the area, which was likely by boat. So the preliminary results of the non-capital grant walkover survey for the Jug Bay Cultural Complex, you can see some of the individual transects that were walked on the map on the right. So each of those was an outing facilitated by the Lost Towns Project in collaboration with all of those other institutions that I mentioned to start. Over 32 linear miles were walked, examining the erosional areas and anywhere that possibly could have yielded cultural resources. The preliminary results of the walkover survey were the identification of 22 new archaeological sites, and examining and seeing kind of the current state for 15 previously identified sites. So there were a lot of archaeology that was examined and found along Jug Bay. I'm going to give a quick kind of example of some of the archaeological sites that were found. So one of the things to look for while doing a walkover survey, you can see on the photo all the way to the left, is oyster shell. So if you find oyster shell inland, it's likely that someone brought it there. So that's kind of a key sign if you're walking in erosional areas. Finding oyster shells is a good idea, a good indicator to stop and look for other evidence of human activity to figure out who might have brought those oyster shells to that vicinity. And so in this case, looking kind of at the central photo, when examining the oyster shells more closely, a very shiny piece of quartz was exposed in the center. And so by further looking around the cluster of oyster shell, small pieces of pottery, which you can see on the rightmost photo in the upper portion, those are small pieces of prehistoric pottery, as well as chipping debris from creating stone tools. So this is evidence of native peoples occupying this Charles Branch site within the last 3,000 years based on the pottery. And so all we can say based on this walkover survey is, yes, there were native peoples here who had both used pots, which then broke, as well as likely created stone tools based on the chipping debris and broken fragments of stone tools that were found. Other areas that were productive, there's an area where, in the Patuxent River Park, where the area was being resodded, and so the topsoil had been kind of churned to then plant new grass. And you can see in the area, again, there's some oyster shell exposed on the picture on the left. And a further examination yielded 2 projectile points, both which are made of quartz and are stemmed points, likely from the late Archaic, as well as chipping debris of quartzite. Another area that was surveyed as part of the Jug Bay survey was Swan Island. This was the most challenging to get to. You can see me hopping across a log in a small kind of stream going through the marsh. And so Stephanie Sperling and I put on muck boots and kind of waded our way through and eventually made it to the promontory, which you can see kind of in the center of the picture in the background. This was the most efficient way to get to the site, and we were greeted with a new archaeological site when we arrived at the island, which included a Lavana point, so a triangular point, which you can see at the bottom on the left picture, as well as chipping debris of quartz and one piece of Native American pottery, probably so from within the last 3,000 years. Another interesting archaeological site that was found during the walkover survey was the Swan Point site. On our way to where we found most of the archaeological materials, my colleague Sean Sharp, which you can see on the left, was examining the exposed soil around the roots of the trees. And while doing this, he found a pretty exciting discovery, which you can see in the photograph in my hand in the center, which is half of a banner stone or an atlatl weight fragment. And I know by looking at half of a broken piece of a stone tool, it's hard to tell what it is. And so I found a picture of a complete one to show you as an example. And so what this fragment is that Sean found eroding near this tree is a piece of what would be a winged banner stone or an atlatl weight. So it'd be a part of the hunting toolkit that pre-contact Native Americans would have used. And so it would, before the bow and arrow was invented. And they're drilled through the center, and so they typically break down the middle. And so what Sean found was half of one of these atlatl weights. Another site that was found during the walkover survey was the Pindle Bluff site. And so here you can see volunteers with the Lost Towns Project surveying along the edge of this erosional bluff along the Patuxent River. And if you look closely in the central picture, you can see a large kind of circular object in between some of the tree roots. And that's a large fragment of pre-contact Native American pottery. So further investigation of the erosional bluff edge yielded lots of pre-contact artifacts, including prehistoric pottery, which you can see up at the top, as well as triangular projectile points, which you can see kind of central right. One's made of quartz, one's made of chert, and then chipping debris made of a variety of materials, including quartzite, jasper, and chert. There you can see I circled the picture, the central picture. I circled the prehistoric pottery in. Additional interesting discoveries that were found during the walkover survey included 2 fossils of scallops. So you can see this Pecten humphreysii. So 2 fossil scallops were found, and we found stone tools made out of an orthoquartzite. So in the center, you can see a Kirk stem point made out of orthoquartzite. The map on the left, I'm going to show 2 things that are going to pop up. So in consultation with local researchers, you can see Jug Bay in the red circle. Nearby south in the purple circle is an area where Miocene orthoquartzite outcrops. And as part of that, these Pecten humphreysii, these fossil scallops, also are exposed. And so we likely, through the Jug Bay survey and then through consultation with local Patuxent researchers, found the location where Native peoples, or one of the locations where Native peoples were going and collecting both fossils as well as orthoquartzite to create stone tools out of. So here you can see the large grain orthoquartzite outcrop, which I'm pointing to. And then in the kind of the inset, you can see a fossil scallop that was found eroded out of that outcrop. And then next to that is that same Kirk stemmed point from the door site. in association with a nodule of this orthoquartzite. So that was a pretty cool ancillary discovery from the Jug Bay walkover surveys, that we were finding interesting materials that we didn't expect to be finding, including fossils in these archaeological sites. But it turns out they probably came from nearby and might have been picked up while people were collecting stone raw material to then make their stone tools out of. Building on the success of the Jug Bay walkover survey, the Lost Towns Project collaborated with Washington College to host their 2019 summer field school at the Jug Bay Wetland Sanctuary. So here you can see Dr. Julie Markin with the crew, the field school crew. And so I'm going to walk through the kind of the process of the field school to discuss what happens in an archaeological field school and what skills these students learned. So the first thing when trying to conduct further archaeological research, it's one thing to walk around and systematically document where archaeological finds are found during a walkover survey. But then if these areas want to be investigated further through archaeological excavation, we needed to first set up and create a grid system so that we could plot artifacts in terms of where they were found across the site. And so here you can see Swan with his theodolite laying in a baseline grid, and Eric on the right with his machete trying to clear a path so he could shoot straight lines to create a straight grid. Once this baseline was set, the Washington College students then conducted a shovel test pitting survey. And so what that consists of is digging circular or square small holes in this case, every 10 meters. These holes are about 40 or 50 centimeters wide, and they're excavated down as deep as possible to investigate and record archaeological resources that might be scattered across this landscape. And the test pitting survey was very informative for then plotting further excavations. And here you can see on the left a field student and a volunteer who had just recently excavated one of those circle test pits, which is kind of on the right bottom of the photo. So you dig all the way down through the dirt and screen the dirt for artifacts. And then the really fun part is when you're really tired after digging as deep as you can to make sure you have gotten through all the cultural resources, then you have to put all the dirt back in the hole. But the shovel test pits were very productive, and you can see on the right, one of the field school students had found his first projectile point, a triangular point. So it was very exciting to both find archaeological resources in those shovel test pits, but also the main goal is to plot distributions across space to figure out where might be a good spot for to do further investigations. So at the Pindell Bluff site, which I'm discussing currently, 77 shovel test pits were excavated in 10 meter intervals, and so you can see them plotted on a map here. So every 10 meters, one of those 50 centimeter square holes was dug as deep as possible to then investigate the distribution of cultural resources along the Pindell Bluff edge. So the walkover survey had found resources eroding out of the edge. The test pits were then designed to move in from the edge a bit to see if the cultural resources extended further inland and might have been in an intact setting. I'm going to focus on two types of resources that were highlighted in the shovel test pits. And so some people might have noticed that earlier this week I launched through the Office of Archaeology, we launched the Maryland Fluted Point Survey. And so I'm always interested in trying to find Paleo-Indian archaeological sites. And so the map on the left shows silicified sandstone or orthoquartzite, which the large grained orthoquartzite is typically associated with early archaic or Paleo-Indian sites. So finding concentrations of that material intrigues me as a place to potentially look for a Paleo-Indian component. And then on the right a lot of my colleagues at the Lost Towns Project, as well as a lot of historic researchers in general, are interested in the colonial period, so the 17th century. And so through the test pit survey, we were able to plot distributions of silicified sandstone, potentially pointing towards a Paleo-Indian and early Archaic site, as well as also plotting colonial artifacts that might be indicative of a 17th century site. And you can see in these photos that there's an overlap between the silicified sandstone and the colonial artifacts, kind of in the central area of the test pit survey. Based on that overlap, and to kind of combine research interests with my interest in Paleo-Indian archaeology and some of my colleagues' interests in colonial archaeology, we decided to put excavation units in that central area. So here you can see on the map the 2019 excavation units. So 6 2x2 meter excavation units were dug as part of the Washington College Field School, and each of those was excavated in 1x1 meter quadrants. And so what this entailed, you can see first on the left image is Jason Elder, who was the TA for the Washington College Field School. He's standing in one of these 1x1 meter squares, and he's using a shovel to shovel skim another one of these squares. The reason we chose 1x1 meter squares as our level of provenience is so that when we found artifacts, we could then plot them back to each one of those 1x1 meter areas. Some people dig these 2x2 meter squares as a whole without internal 1x1 meter quadrants, but then when trying to find and track concentrations of artifacts, it gets harder because they could have come from anywhere in that 2x2 meter square. So we tried to further refine our distributions by excavating and recording archaeological provenience to 1x1 meter squares. Once the topsoil was excavated through and we reached intact subsoil, which you can see on the photo on the right, which is kind of more of a yellowy color, then troweling occurred. So you can see one of the field school students with his dustpan full of dirt, which he's now transferring to a bucket. And you can see Sean sitting in his excavation unit, carefully troweling to both look for archaeological features as well as to plot artifacts in place. The dirt that is collected from the excavation areas is then taken and it's passed through archaeological screens. This is kind of the hardest and most time-consuming part, especially when working and looking for pre-contact artifacts. And so this is what takes a lot of training by the field school students, is to be able to look at very small chips of stone and pebbles and be able to tell apart what are culturally modified pieces of stone or small bits of pre-contact pottery, and tell that apart from what's just natural pebbles in the ground. And so at the Pindell Bluff site, since we were looking for both colonial artifacts as well as for potentially Paleo-Indian artifacts, we decided to use 1/8 inch size screen mesh, which is relatively small. A lot of archaeological sites use 1/4 inch mesh, which would allow smaller artifacts to fall through. But since we were looking for Paleo-Indian and colonial artifacts, we chose to use the smaller mesh size, which meant that each bucket took longer to screen. And so we got less dirt moved and we covered less space, but we recovered more very small artifacts that might have been key to interpreting both the potential Paleo-Indian site as well as the colonial site. Excavating down through the ground continued. You can see the profile on the right. So we would go through the top kind of dark brown plow zone, and then the next area that was hit was the intact subsoil, which is kind of an orange. And we would dig down through that subsoil until we stopped encountering artifacts, which typically occurred when we hit that kind of lighter more leached out subsoil. And so the colors that you're seeing there, going from dark brown to then kind of an orangey yellow to a lighter yellow, are the result of leaching of organic materials. So the dark brown at the top is the most enriched in organics, and as you get deeper down, there's less root activity, less bioturbation associated with earthworms and other animals, and so you get less organics. And so we would carefully keep track of how far down we're digging in the soil and what the soil looked like as a way to tie site formation processes with the archaeological materials that we were recovering. It turned out that most of the artifacts that we found were found around the interface between the plow zone and the subsoil. So kind of where the dark brown then transitions to the kind of orangey yellow. And that makes sense for an upland site, because what typically happens is the topsoil, which is enriched in organics, is also where most of the earthworms are moving, most of the rodents are burrowing, most of the roots are kind of trickling through. And so that topsoil kind of is the most active. And so artifacts or anything that's kind of dropped on the surface will tend to work its way through that top dark brown soil until it kind of hits the top of that more yellowy subsoil, which is less active and less organic enriched. And so that's the pattern we found at Pindell Bluff, is that most of the artifacts tended to cluster around the contact or the interface between the topsoil and the subsoil. And so to make sure we kept track of that, you can see on the left, two of the field school students making detailed measurements and stratigraphic profiles of the soil strata, the soil stratigraphy. The results of the excavation, first we'll look at the pre-contact artifacts. So in terms of lithic debitage, on the left, all of the chipping debris associated with the production and maintenance of stone tools. And then on the right is an image showing the low-fired ceramics, which are the pre-contact pottery, and those are looked at by weight. The numbers in each of those squares corresponds to what the unit designation was. So it's just keeping track of the units. And then you can see within those units, the different quadrants are what we use to plot the concentration of artifacts. So first, looking at the lithic debitage, you can see there's really one main hotspot kind of in between units 4 and 5, kind of in the top part of that graph. But lithic debitage was scattered throughout. So although in between 4 and 5 is the hotspot, anywhere you dug, we were recovering many fragments of lithic debitage. Looking at the low-fired ceramics to see different patterning, they don't cluster exactly the same as the lithics. So the low-fired ceramics, you can see there is a hotspot where 4 and 5, where units 4 and 5 are located, but also in unit 6, and then another one in unit 1. So it looks like the distribution of pre-contact pottery fragments doesn't entirely mirror the lithic debitage. And that would make sense, as we'll see when we look at the diagnostic artifacts, but Pindell Bluff was occupied probably for 13,000 years, whereas low-fired ceramics are made for the last 3,000 years. And so this lithic debitage is showing patterning that might be have 13,000 years of patterning in it, whereas the low-fired ceramics is probably within the last 3,000 years of patterning. Looking at the colonial artifacts that were recovered in this area, you can see they're all pictured in this image. So there's a piece of there are pieces of delft, which you can see B and C, as well as glazed redwares A and D, a piece of a kaolin pipe bowl, which is E, and then hand-wrought nails F. So all of these are indicative of 17th century artifacts. And you can tell they're relatively small, and so it was probably a good idea and was relatively important that we used that smaller 1/8-inch mesh to recover things, especially like the small delft fragments B and C. Some of the prehistoric artifacts that were recovered include pieces of ceramics. And so on the left, the leftmost piece is a piece of soapstone pottery. associated with the transitional Archaic about 3,500 years ago. And then you can see fragments of low-fired clay ceramics on the right three images. And I know when people look at artifacts that are found on archaeological sites, it's typically small fragments, which is what these are. And so what I've decided to do for this lecture is to find images that show what these fragments represent. Because as an archaeologist, a lot of archaeologists can look at these pictures and in their head envision what the entire artifact might have looked like whole. So we'll kind of do that, but through the presentation. So first, there, our fragment of soapstone pottery likely came from a steatite or soapstone vessel, which again, they first occur around 3,500 years ago and are associated with the terminal or the transitional Archaic period. And then relatively quickly after the invention of soapstone pottery, we start seeing low-fired ceramics. And so those occur starting around 3,000 years ago. And so here's a picture of one of these clay pre-contact ceramic vessels. One of the cool discoveries from the Pindell Bluff site is highlighted in the image on the right, which is the topmost piece of ceramic, which has a hole drilled through it. See the circular hole? That was likely a repair hole. So in the image that I've chosen to show you of a pre-contact vessel, pottery, ceramic vessel, you can see kind of in the center of the picture, there are two holes that were drilled. And so what would typically occur is if a vessel were to crack, those holes would be drilled on opposite sides of the crack and then tied together with sinew or twine to then keep that clay pottery from breaking into more pieces. And so it's kind of cool to see evidence of someone maybe 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago repairing their low-fired clay ceramic by drilling this hole. Other interesting artifacts that were found during the Washington College Field School include a fragment of a gorget and a fragment of a celt. And again, to show you what these things might have looked like whole, first, here's a fragment of a gorget, which then is compared to a complete gorget. So you can see in the fragment, if you first look at the complete gorget, you can see there are typically two holes drilled in the center of the gorget, and the outside of the gorget has these tally marks. And then in the fragment found at Pindell Bluff, it has broken across one of the drill holes. So people aren't really sure what gorgets are used for. Based on that name, it's suggested maybe it's some sort of jewelry that's worn around the neck. But what exactly a gorget is unclear. There have been other arguments that perhaps it was a tie-on atlatl weight, or maybe associated with the production of cordage by using the drilled holes to hold individual cords. But in reality, what they're used for is unclear. The celt fragment on the right, you can then see a complete celt on the left. So celts are fragments are groundstone tools that would be used for heavy woodworking. And so in the kind of top left, you can see a picture of what one of these celts would have looked like hafted. So the stone bit would have been kind of the working portion of an axe head. And then it would have been hafted into probably some sort of wooden handle to then facilitate its use as a chopping tool for woodworking. Also recovered from the Pindell Bluff site were prehistoric smoking pipe fragments. So you can see some of those on the left, and then there's a blown up, more of a close up of the image on the right, which is a clay low-fired smoking pipe fragment that has a lot of little dots you can see, so it's decorated. So again, to see what these things look like whole, first, the image on the left, the platform pipe fragment, here's a whole image of a platform pipe. So this is a carved stone smoking pipe. There were ceramic smoking pipe fragments as well, and you can see I refit them back together to form the whole. So these things were pretty tough. They're small fragments, but when you put them back together, you can see the hole that's drilled into them. And these are likely representative of a tube pipe. And so the image on the right is a complete whole tube pipe and likely dates to the Middle Woodland period. And then the close-up of the image on the right is a fragment of a low-fired clay pipe, and it's most likely a late woodland prehistoric smoking pipe. And so there on the left, you can see what one of these whole smoking pipes might have looked like. And so we found a fragment of the bowl. Projectile points that were recovered from the Pindell Bluff site include show evidence of people at the site repeatedly for the last 13,000 years. So starting at the top left, there's a Lavana point, which is a triangle point made out of chert. There is a potentially Hopewell point, which is a side notched point made out of cobble chert. There are Bear Island points made out of quartzite, which date to the transitional Archaic. Kind of a large, broad spear of some sort made out of rhyolite all the way top right. Moving down bottom left is a quartzite Savannah River point. And then in the kind of this bottom center is a rhyolite Stanley point or a Kirk stem. So either Middle Archaic or Early Archaic. And then the bottom rightmost point is a Paleo-Indian fluted point or a Clovis point made out of jasper. So of course, as someone who's most excited about finding and researching Paleo-Indian archaeology, I was very ecstatic at the recovery of a Clovis point or a fluted point at Pindell Bluff. And so there wasn't much Clovis material, but our premise and our shovel testing did a good job in finding one of these hard to find Paleo-Indian sites. And so what we had originally found in the shovel test pits was the flake that you see in A, which is that large grained orthoquartzite. And that material has been shown to repeatedly occur on Paleo-Indian and early Archaic sites. And so finding one chip of that stone or a few chips of that stone in a few shovel test pits nearby was enough to indicate that it was a good idea to open up further unit excavations in this area to attempt to find additional Paleo-Indian artifacts. And by opening up those 2 by 2 meter excavation units, additional Paleo-Indian artifacts were recovered, including B, which is a chip of weathering amber chalcedony, which is another type of stone that typically occurs on Paleo-Indian and early Archaic sites, and then C, which is the Clovis point. And that Clovis point, you can tell it's rather small. It looks to most likely be a tip of a Clovis point that broke and then was rebased. So the tip fragment broke off of a bigger point. That fragment was saved and then refluted, which is why it has a kind of a triangular outline. So I was really happy with kind of the goal of, at least my sub-goal of the Pindell Bluff excavations were to track down a Paleo-Indian component, and that did occur. And so hopefully future research might yield additional evidence about a Paleo-Indian component in this area. So overall, the Washington College Field School was a great success. The students learned the entire process of archaeological research, from conducting walkover surveys, to then laying out a grid, to then conducting a shovel test pit survey, to then moving to more intensive unit excavations. And the field school recovered evidence of repeated occupations at the site, all the way from the Paleo-Indian period about 13,000 years ago into the 17th century with that colonial occupation. One thing that the excavations proved, which makes it difficult to study each of those components at the Pindell Bluff site, is that due to this upland setting, the archaeological record at the Pindell Bluff site was a palimpsest, meaning that everything's mixed together. The 13,000-year-old stuff could be found at the same level as the 5,000-year-old stuff, which would be found at the same level as the historic archaeological component. So everything from 13,000 years ago to the 16 and 1700s was all at that contact between the bottom of the plow zone and the top of the subsoil. And so unlike stratified sites where the deeper down you dig, the older the artifacts become, in this site, everything's at the same level and mixed. And so the best way to continue forward for doing continued investigations into the archaeological components at the Pindell Bluff site would be to do a detailed study of the horizontal patterning in the diagnostics. And so what that means is looking for indicators of the different types of raw materials that were being used throughout time, looking at the different types of prehistoric or pre-contact pottery that was being made and looking at those distributions horizontally, looking at different types of historic artifacts. And so the best way to really further investigate the Pindell Bluff site would be to find concentrations of specific types of artifacts that people are interested in studying and then investigate those areas further. But none of this research could have been conducted without the enthusiastic support of Washington College and their field school students. So they're the ones who, in addition to learning how to do archaeology, were also doing a lot of hard field work to record and document this archaeological site. And so with that, thanks for your time, and also would like to again acknowledge the research partners that made this survey and research at Jug Bay possible. And so that's the Lost Towns Project, Anne Arundel County's Cultural Resources Division, the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, the Jug Bay Wetland Sanctuary, and Washington College. And so if you'd like further information about the research at Jug Bay, you can email me at zachary.singer@maryland.gov or visit the MHT website, and also visit all of the websites of our partners who facilitated and made this research possible. So thank you for your time, and happy Archaeology Month.